The morning light over the channel was pale and cold, the kind of light that revealed everything yet offered no comfort. Waves rolled in heavy with the smell of salt and cordite, carrying the bodies of men who had never reached the sand. Machine gun fire stitched the waterline, carving white scars across the surf. Behind a low seawall, hundreds of American soldiers pressed themselves into the gravel, unable to move forward, unable to go back, trapped between duty and death. This was not what the planners had promised. The bombardment that was supposed to break the German defenses had missed. The tanks that were meant to lead the assault lay at the bottom of the sea. Every assumption, every line on every map had shattered in the first minutes of the landing. And then, through the smoke and confusion, a 51-year-old American general stepped off a landing craft and walked upright across the killing ground as if the battlefield itself had paused for him. His name was Norman Cota, and the men around him would later say that in those moments he seemed less like a commander and more like a challenge to fate. What makes a man stand when everyone else is pinned to the earth? And how does a single decision, on a single morning, change the course of a war? The catastrophe at Omaha did not begin on the sand. It began months earlier, in conference rooms where the planners of Operation Overlord put their faith in firepower. American doctrine insisted that sheer weight of explosives could break any fixed defense. Battleships would pulverize the bunkers. Bombers would crater the strongpoints. The infantry would advance across a beaten shoreline, meeting only scattered resistance. On paper, it looked inevitable. But across the channel, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood the danger more clearly than anyone. Having witnessed Allied bombardments in North Africa, he knew what naval guns and heavy bombers could do. So he rebuilt the Atlantic Wall not to withstand the first blow, but to survive it. He ordered concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, positioned them with interlocking fields of fire, and filled every approach with mines, steel hedgehogs, and wooden stakes tipped with explosives. "Stop them at the waterline," he told his officers. "If they get inland, we lose the war." For the Germans of the 352nd Infantry Division, nearly 12,000 men defending a 5-mile front, this was not a slogan. It was a promise. Each bunker was plotted to cover another. Each machine gunner knew the exact distance to the surf. Each artillery crew had pre-registered every square meter of beach. If the Allies came, they would come into a geometry of death. At dawn on June 6th, everything Rommel had prepared suddenly mattered. The naval bombardment fired from too far offshore. Most shells overshot their targets, exploding harmlessly inland. Bombers dropped 13,000 bombs into empty fields, terrified of hitting their own approaching troops. Not a single German bunker on the bluffs was destroyed. When the first wave of American infantry approached the shore at 6:30 a.m., they were walking into defenses that were untouched, awake, loaded, and waiting. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed directly in front of a fortified strongpoint known as WN-71. As the ramps of their landing craft dropped, German machine guns opened fire with mechanical precision. 32 men fell before they even reached the water. Those who survived the first burst plunged into the surf carrying 60 pounds of equipment too heavy to swim, too slow to dodge. Some drowned. Others were cut down as they tried to wade forward. Within 30 minutes, 96% of the company was dead, dying, or unable to fight. They had ceased to exist as a functional unit. Around them, the beach was breaking apart. DD tanks meant to support the infantry sank in the rough sea. Engineers carrying Bangalore torpedoes were killed before they could clear the wire. Radios shorted out in the water. Units landed in the wrong sectors. Officers were separated from their men, and entire companies dissolved under fire. The seawall became a graveyard of equipment, helmets, rifles, packs, abandoned by soldiers who could do nothing but press themselves into the gravel and pray the next shell was meant for someone else. The plan had assumed the defenses would be broken. Instead, the soldiers were. And Omaha Beach, 5 miles of sand and steel, was beginning to swallow the invasion whole. The turning point on Omaha did not arrive with a new plan or a sudden stroke of luck. It arrived in the form of a single man walking upright through fire. Brigadier General Norman Cota moved across the beach as though immune to the chaos around him. Bullets snapping past his shoulders, mortar blasts shaking the ground, sand spraying his uniform. To the soldiers pressed behind the seawall, he was the first figure they had seen all morning, who was not crawling, hiding, or dying. Cota's presence alone broke through the paralysis, but it was his actions that changed the battle. Near a section of shredded wire, he found a group of Rangers pinned down by a machine gun 70 yards up the bluff. Twice they had tried to cross. Twice the first man through the gap had been killed. The Rangers were waiting for orders, Any orders when Cota strode up and asked who they were. 5th Rangers, someone shouted. Cota looked at the gap, then at the men, and uttered the words that would become immortal in Army history. Well, goddammit, Rangers, lead the way. To these though. Then he walked through the gap himself. For a moment, it seemed impossible. No German gunner fired. No mortar dropped. The battlefield held its breath. When Cota reached the far side of the wire and waved them forward, the Rangers followed not because the danger had lessened, but because a 5-1-year-old general had just shown them that movement was still possible. 12 men made it through before the machine gun opened up again. They scattered into the tall grass of the bluff, hugging the earth as rounds tore past. Crawling upward, Cota helped direct suppressing fire, while 2 Rangers maneuvered around the flank. They tossed grenades into the firing slit. The gun fell silent. It was 8:04 a.m., and for the first time since the invasion began, an American unit had broken a German strongpoint on Omaha Beach. That single success rippled outward. Along the beach, scattered groups of infantry began to rise from behind the seawall. Sergeants gathered whoever was nearby, 3 men, 5 men, sometimes only 1, and pushed toward gaps in the wire. Engineers, sheltered by hastily formed fire teams, managed to slide Bangalore torpedoes under the obstacles. The detonations tore 4-meter holes through the tangle of steel and barbed wire. Through each new opening, infantry poured forward in bursts, scrambling up the slopes before the Germans could adjust their fire. The Americans were no longer attacking as regiments or battalions. They were infiltrating small, determined groups moving unpredictably, forcing the defenders to fight in every direction at once. Strongpoints that dominated the beach from the front suddenly came under attack from behind. Bunkers designed to repel frontal assaults were breached through their blindsides. German mortar teams found American riflemen crawling toward their observation posts. Artillery spotters who had been directing devastating fire onto the beach were themselves overrun. By 9 a.m., the psychological momentum, once entirely German, had shifted. The defenders were still strong, still entrenched, still deadly, but they were no longer fighting soldiers who believed they were trapped. They were fighting soldiers who had seen a general walk into gunfire and survive, and who now believed that victory lay somewhere beyond the next ridge. Omaha Beach was no longer a place to die. It had become a place to break through. By mid-morning, the German defensive line along Omaha was beginning to unravel, not because its fortifications had failed, but because they were being bypassed. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop organized assaults by battalions moving in formation. It was never meant to withstand dozens of small, scattered American units, climbing the bluffs from every angle, slipping through gaps, appearing behind bunkers, and attacking strong points from directions the defenders had not prepared for. What had begun as a slaughter was turning into a fragmentation of the German line. Commanders inland sensed it first. Reports reaching Colonel Ernst Goth at the 916th Grenadier Regiment headquarters painted a picture he didn't want to believe. American infantry were no longer pinned on the beach. They were advancing slowly, bloodily, but relentlessly. At some strong points, German machine gunners were running low on ammunition. Mortar teams were rationing shells. Artillery batteries, cut off from supply trucks by cratered roads and ruined communication lines, had only a fraction of their planned load. The Americans, whom they had been assured would die on the waterline, were now climbing through the hedgerows. Still, orders from higher headquarters were uncompromising. Hitler had personally demanded that every meter of French soil be held. Retreat was forbidden. That meant German soldiers stood their ground until their ammunition ran out, until their positions were flanked, until they were overwhelmed or killed. Some surrendered in small groups. Others fought to the last round. All of them were witnessing the collapse of a plan that had been sold to them as unbreakable. For the Americans, the breakthrough came at staggering cost. On the beach, and in the draws behind it, medics worked with bare hands and scavenged supplies. Captain Emerald Rolston's medical company was nearly wiped out before even touching the sand. 80% casualties when their landing craft was hit offshore. Staff Sergeant Arnold Lambert treated more than 300 wounded men behind a 3-foot concrete slab that served as the only cover on Fox Green. He worked 14 hours under fire, triaging who could be saved and who could not. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, drawn heavily from Bedford, Virginia, lost 19 men in the first minutes at Dog Green, and more later in the campaign. In a town of just 3,000, nearly every family felt the weight of a telegram delivered to the door. Bedford's sacrifice would become a symbol of the cost of freedom ordinary men caught in extraordinary violence. By late morning, American forces controlled 3 of the 5 critical beach exits. Small groups were pushing inland toward Colleville-sur-Mer. The Germans, unable to bring up reserves in daylight due to Allied air superiority, had no way to seal the breach. Omaha Beach was no longer in danger of collapsing, but victory came drenched in loss. Nearly 2,400 Americans became casualties at Omaha alone, with roughly 700 killed. Units that had trained together for years were shredded in minutes. Platoons became handfuls. Companies evaporated. And yet, the breakthrough stood fragile, hard-won, carved out by men who chose to move forward when staying meant certain death. When the smoke thinned and the tide rolled in, Omaha Beach was secure, the price written in blood. In Washington and London, the success of D-Day was measured not only by the ground gain but by the long chain of consequences that would follow. Omaha Beach, more than any other sector, carried a strategic weight far beyond its 5 miles of sand. It was the hinge that held the Western Front together. Without it, the entire Allied invasion risked becoming a fractured, isolated assault, one that Germany could defeat piece by piece. The British and Canadian beaches to the east, Gold, Juno, and Sword, had succeeded in pushing inland with comparatively lighter casualties. Utah Beach to the west had also secured its objectives. But none of these landing sites offered the depth, the road network, or the direct access to high ground that Omaha provided. A failure there would have opened a 30-mile gap between the Allied forces, a void the Germans could exploit with concentrated counterattacks. Even divisions that had been pushed off the sand might have been forced back into the sea in the following days. American strategists knew that logistics were destiny. The push toward Paris and the eventual drive into Germany required deep water access, room for supply depots, and corridors wide enough to support armored thrusts. Omaha was the anchor. Without it, the front would stretch thin, supply lines would choke, and the momentum of the invasion so painstakingly built would collapse under its own weight. Across the world, the stakes were even higher. Stalin had long suspected the Western Allies of delaying the Second Front in Europe. Another failed amphibious assault, especially on the scale of Overlord, might have confirmed his worst suspicions. Desperation could have pushed the Soviet Union to negotiate a separate peace, altering not only the map of Europe but the entire post-war balance of power. Instead, the breakthrough at Omaha sent a different message. The Western Allies were all in. They had bled on the beaches, endured catastrophic losses, and still pushed forward. It signaled commitment, resolve, and the beginning of a sustained offensive that Germany could not hope to reverse. For the American public, Omaha became both a triumph and a mourning ground. News of the casualties filtered home slowly, sometimes incompletely, but the broader meaning was unmistakable. The beach was a gateway not only to France, but to the liberation of a continent, the collapse of Nazi Germany, and the creation of a world shaped by Allied victory. Omaha mattered because the world after 1944 would be built on what happened there. In the quiet hours of the evening, long after the smoke of battle has drifted out to sea, Omaha Beach looks ordinary, just another stretch of sand shaped by wind and tide. But history is not written in what a place looks like today. It is written in what it demanded of the people who stood there. And on June 6, 1944, that narrow shoreline demanded everything. What happened on Omaha was not the triumph of a flawless plan. The plan had collapsed before the first wave reached the sand. It was not the triumph of overwhelming firepower. The bombardment failed, the tanks sank, the radios died. Instead, the breakthrough came from men who understood that even when strategy falters, courage does not have to. It came from sergeants gathering shattered squads, from engineers crawling forward with explosives, from medics saving lives with torn bandages and bare hands. And above all, it came from a general who walked into gunfire because someone had to show that the impossible could still be done. Norman Cota never sought glory for what he did at Omaha. His tombstone at West Point makes no mention of the beach, no reference to the moment that shaped the entire invasion. Yet his legacy runs through every ridge his men climbed, every bunker they cleared, every decision that turned despair into forward motion. Leadership is not a medal. It is the quiet force that makes others rise when everything around them is falling. The liberation of Europe did not begin in speeches or war rooms. It began when men, who had every reason to surrender, chose instead to move one step inland. Those steps taken in fear, exhaustion, and determination changed the fate of nations. They formed the first cracks in the wall that would eventually collapse the Third Reich. And they remind us, even now, that history turns on the courage of individuals who stand their ground when the world needs them to. As you think about their sacrifice, Consider this. What lesson do we carry forward from a day when the cost was so high and the future so uncertain? If stories like this matter to you, stories of leadership, sacrifice, and the fragile hinge moments of history, feel free to share your thoughts below. We read every voice, from veterans to students, from Texas to Tasmania. And if you wish to follow more untold chapters from the past, you are welcome to stay with us on this journey. Because history is not only remembered, it is kept alive one story at a time.